turnovers, shift transitions. And that's not random, that's a system signal. And I want to introduce a number now that I'll return to several times today within the presentation. That's 317 days. That's the average time between a first missing incident and a repeat incident. And that's based on the data set that we have. I want you to hold that number because it becomes very important when we start talking about what to do. So before we go further, I want to be precise about what we mean by wandering, because I hear the term often used quite loosely, sometimes in ways that obscure the actual risk. Critical wandering, as we define it in research, is specifically about a person who has left a care setting and is unaware of their own situation, where they are, when they are, and what is happening around them. That disorientation is what turns a walk into a crisis. And here's the distinction that matters most practically. Not every person who wanders will become a missing incident, but every missing incident starts with someone getting lost. That interval between wandering and going missing is our intervention window. The first 6 weeks after admission are particularly high risk. I see this in incident data regularly. A new environment, a disrupted routine, a brain that is searching for something familiar in an unfamiliar place. That early window is exactly where care teams and families most need to have already completed their PHI conversations, not as bureaucratic checkboxes, but as genuine preparation. And what the research does tell us, the data I'm going to share comes from two peer-reviewed publications that published in 2024, one in the BMC Geriatrics and one in the Journal of Aging, both drawing from the client data set I've worked with. I'm really proud of this work. It's rigorous, and I think it moves the conversation in an important direction. The core finding that I want to highlight is the 90.6% safe return rate when Medical Alert was involved in a missing incident. I want to be clear about what that number means and what it doesn't mean. It doesn't mean that the program is magic. What it means is that rapid identification produces better outcomes. When a good Samaritan or a first responder can immediately identify who this person is, who to call, and what their medical situation is, outcomes improve dramatically. And that's a PHI or personal health information story as much as a safety story. The other finding I want to flag is that 1 in 5 people in these incidents experience a repeat incident, which means for a significant proportion of this population, the first incident is not the last. That has real implications for how we structure consent, and I'll come back to that later. So, who is at risk? The risk factor analysis I'm drawing on here looked at over 25,000 subscribers or clients. The headline finding is that 28.5 of those with a dementia diagnosis had a history of critical wandering, nearly 1 in 3. When I sit in on care conferences and I look at a room full of dementia residents, that ratio is in my head. There are several factors I want to highlight specifically because they have PHI implications, not just safety implications. The first of which is language. Limited proficiency in an official Canadian language is associated with elevated wandering risk, but it's also a direct barrier to meaningful PHI consent. If a resident cannot fully understand what they are being asked to agree to, and if their substitute decision maker is navigating a language barrier as well, then the quality of consent we are obtaining is genuinely compromised. That's not a technical compliance issue, it's an equity issue. And I don't think we talk about that enough. The other finding worth sitting with is living in a care home itself is associated with elevated risk. And that's not a criticism of care homes. It reflects the concentration of a high-risk population in one setting. But it means that wandering risk, in a sense, is structural. It's baked into the demographic of long-term care. You can't opt out of it. And now the 317-day window, which I had mentioned earlier. And here's why this matters so much to me. When I look at the recurrence data, what I see is not randomness. I see a window. An 11-month interval between incidents is time. It is enough time to have real conversation with the family, enough time to update a consent framework, enough time to revisit a care plan, ask harder questions, adjust a safety protocol. What I see too often in practice, and I say this as someone who reviews incident data regularly, is that after a missing incident is resolved safely, there is an enormous collective exhale. The incident is documented, the family is relieved, the staff debrief, and then quietly the clock starts again. From a PHIPAA perspective or standpoint, that window is also the time to revisit whether your standing consent is still appropriate. Dementia progresses, substitute decision makers change. A resident who had some capacity to participate in consent conversations 6 months ago may not have that capacity today. If we only establish consent once at admission and never revisit it, we are not meeting the spirit of the legislation, let alone the standard of good care. So I want to name something that I think is at the heart of why this problem is so hard. When a resident with advanced dementia goes missing, the people who need to help them, police, paramedics, emergency staff, good Samaritans, need to know immediately who this person is, what their medication is, who to call. All of that is personal health information. All of that is governed by BHIPAA. And the person who would normally authorize that disclosure cannot do so because the condition that created the emergency is also the condition that removed their capacity to consent. That's what I call the PHI paradox of wandering. It's not hypothetical. I see it play out in the incident narratives in our data. First responders calling care homes and getting hesitation. Staff unsure of what they're permitted to say. Precious minutes lost, not because of bad intent, but because no one had worked out in advance what the answer was. The gap between what staff want to do and what they believe they are allowed to do is one of the most consequential compliance implicitly, rapidly making PHI decisions. Who can I tell what? What am I authorized to say to this officer? Is the person who just called claiming to be the son actually the substitute decision maker? She has not consulted the PHIPAA policy manual. She will not, and we should not expect her to. What she needs is something absorbed before the crisis, a clear pre-authorized practice answer to each of those questions. And that's an organizational responsibility, not a personal one. When I review incident narratives and I see disclosure decisions that were inconsistent or incomplete, I don't think the problem was the nurse. The problem was that nobody gave her the answer before she needed it. So the program I work with most directly in this space, which is Safe and Found, is built on what I think is a genuine solution to that PHI paradox. Collect consent before the emergency happens. So when a person living with dementia or their substitute decision maker enrolls in Safe and Found, they provide prior informed consent for health information to be disclosed to first responders in an emergency. That consent is given deliberately, outside of crisis conditions, and with full understanding of what it means. So when a police officer finds a disoriented older adult 2 kilometers from a care home at 11 p.m., and calls our emergency hotline, there is no hesitation, no ambiguity, no PHIPAA question to resolve. That disclosure is immediate and it is lawful because the consent was established prospectively. The outcome data speaks to how much this matters. In incidents where we were involved, 90.6% of people returned home safely. 90% of those found were wearing their IDs at the time of discovery. And what I find most meaningful in that data is not the percentage, it's what it represents, people who came home. And in my view, the PHI architecture that enabled that outcome is as important as any GPS device or door alarm. So one of the areas I've become interested in, both professionally and personally, is what happens after a missing incident. Because in my experience, that's where both the best learning and the most significant gaps live. The concept of a structured return discussion was developed through the University of Waterloo's Managing the Risk of Disappearance Among Persons with Dementia. And this approach borrows directly from how we handle the aftermath of missing children incidents. There is a structured debrief, what happened, what needs to change, and who needs support. We don't do that for dementia, not routinely, and I think that's a significant failure. From a PHI standpoint specifically, the return discussion described is not going to fix itself. It requires national standards, funded training, and the political will to treat a missing elder with dementia as a national safety and rights issue, not a provincial one. And I want to close with something I feel strongly about because I think it shapes how this whole conversation should be framed. There is a tendency in healthcare privacy discussions to position the HIPAA compliance and resident safety as being in tension, as though protecting information and protecting people are competing priorities. I reject that framing, and the evidence I've shared today, I think, supports rejecting it. They should never be in tension or competing against each other. When we build consent frameworks that anticipate emergencies, when we do the work before the crisis, when we train staff to act with both legal confidence and ethical care, we don't have to choose. We protect the residents' right to have their information handled appropriately, and we protect their right to come home safely. Those are the same rights expressed differently. The residents in your care homes who are living with dementia deserve both. They deserve a system that has thought carefully about what happens if they walk out the door. They deserve staff who know what they're authorized to do. And they deserve families who are brought into that conversation early enough to matter. And that's a standard I hold myself to in my research. And it's the standard I invite all of us to hold into our organizations. So thank you all, and happy to take questions if any. Thank you.